Welcome to another episode of Hollywood Kitchen. And when I was deciding about what Christmas episode to do, I started going through a lot of different names and dates and information, and I stumbled across the fact that December 25th of 2024 will mark the 100th anniversary of the birth of Rod Serling, who is without question one of the greatest and most influential writers in television history. So I felt a tribute was in order. And since I have to be back east at Christmas, I thought we would tackle this early in the month and talk about Rod's life, his career, and the one recipe he made that was not on a grill. So we're going to make that. And I'm joined by two gentlemen who are both new to the Hollywood Kitchen universe. We have my friend, writer Bob Skier. He has a master's degree in screenwriting, teaches at UCLA, writes for animated TV series, and you have a movie coming up, Bob.
I do. It's a film
We'll
called
talk about
Goldbeak.
that.
Yeah.
It's a film called Goldbeak. It was produced in China. It came out a few years ago in China, and it's going to be coming out from Lionsgate this year. I'm not sure if it's going to be streaming or in theaters, but I'm really looking forward to people getting to finally see it.
Excellent. And we have Mark Zachary, who is an author, a television writer, a TV producer, has been collaborating with Guillermo del Toro on a new project, and he wrote The Twilight Zone Companion. This book was a bestseller when it came out in 1996, and it is still in print and very easily available today. And both of these men are terrific writers and have been very heavily influenced by Rod Serling. So I kind of have to pinch myself that I know you guys and that I can get these kind of people on the show. It's kind of blows my mind, but thank you so much for being here today.
You're very welcome. And
Thanks
actually,
for
the
having us. Yeah.
book actually came out in 1982, and
Oh,
that's the third edition. I updated it just recently, and because people kept telling me stories about the Twilight Zone, behind the scenes stories. Also, I wanted to have audio and video links because now with the internet, you can actually watch some of these amazing rarities of Rod Serling giving speeches and things like that. It's really an amazing
Oh,
time.
and speaking of all this, thinking of all things Twilight Zone, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the unfortunate passing of a neighbor of mine, Earl Holliman, who
Mm,
starred in some really pivotal Twilight Zone episodes, including, I believe, the very first episode.
yeah, he was in the pilot. Where is everybody? And he was also in Forbidden Planet, many other things. He was very distinctive, very memorable. So that's a sad passing. But for those of us who work in TV and film, our work lives on, which is really great. Knowing people will still be entertained by Mr. Holloman's work hundreds of years from now.
oh yeah. So how did each one of you first come to the work of Rod Serling?
Well, Bob, why don't you start?
Oh my. Um, I know I watched episodes of Twilight Zone when I was a kid. I remember my friends and I sitting around going, "Oh, did you see the one?" And of course, we'd always talk about the twist endings and things because that's how you start talking about, any Twilight Zone episode. Did you see the one where it turned out that guy was from Mars and the other guy was from Venus? It's one of those. But for me, for me, Planet of the Apes is
Mm,
the real high point for me because the film has come to mean so much to me in my life. That whole film series and his work on adapting it was absolutely phenomenal. He was brought in very early, and he was brought in by the original director, who was Blake Edwards.
mm,
And he told the producers, I want to hire this guy. And so they brought, and I think he was still doing Twilight Zone at the time. This is
mhm,
still very much in the early 60s, 63, 64. So
yeah,
it's right around the time either Twilight Zone was on or it was just winding down. But
mhm,
uh, but Blake Edwards was going to be the very was going to direct Planet of the Apes, and then it went to Franklin Schaffner, who
yes. Who was
also wrote the Patton and made the film into an absolute classic. It
yeah.
was Rod Serling's idea, by the way, to have the very ending be, spoiler alert, the
Mhm,
Statue of Liberty.
mm,
Um, and I had the a memo from Pierre Bol, the author of the original Monkey Planet from it's a French novel, and in his notes he said, "I can't take this thing seriously if you're going to end with the Statue of Liberty." And what's very funny about that is that the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France,
Mm.
and in a way, so is Planet of the Apes.
Yeah, yeah. And but certainly Serling was a great choice for it. And interestingly enough, the drafts of the script that Rod wrote uh, took place as the novel does in a technological society, a 20th century level of technology, and they've decided that that would be too expensive to make, and so then they hired a blacklisted writer who'd actually done The Bridge on the River Kwai, which was also written by Pierre Boulle, the original novel, and he made it sort of more of a a more simple technology that they could afford, those foam houses and so forth. But Rod's draft has recently been adapted into a graphic novel, so you can actually see what Rod intended, and it's very very fun to read through that and visualize what that might have been like. And but it was certainly Rod was a perfect choice for that movie.
And just so it's said out loud, since we're talking about writers, the writer in question is Michael Wilson,
Yes,
and his writing for Bridge on the River Kwai actually got an Academy Award, but
yes,
because he wasn't listed, it only said based on a novel by. Pierre
yes.
Boulle was the one who was brought up on stage to accept the Oscar, and he accepted it and didn't understand or speak a word of English.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
uh,
Yep.
so there's, a great deal of irony there. I think that the Academy now acknowledges Michael Wilson as the writer and as the Academy Award winner. They have gone through a lot of the blacklisted writers and given them the credit they've deserved. But
Yes,
but
exactly.
we
And oh, go ahead, please.
but we digress. Let's
Mhm.
circle back to Twilight Zone and Mark.
Yeah, well, the my initial exposure to Twilight Zone was very Twilight Zone-y in and of itself because I was a little kid. I was, I think, around 8 years old, something like that. And I was up past my bedtime, and down in the garage under our apartment, my stepfather was a bit of a handyman, a tinkerer. And so he had two TV sets on a high shelf, one of which only got picture and one of which only got sound. And he had them tuned always to two different channels. So it was a very trippy, strange collision of different shows. And I noticed on the screen that got the picture, there was this flying saucer landing on an alien planet, and these three guys exiting that spaceship to find a wrecked copy of their own spaceship, and they go inside and find their own dead bodies. Now, I had no idea what show it was, no idea who those actors were. It was only long afterwards that I would learn it's a great hour-long Twilight Zone episode called Death Ship that starred Jack Klugman and Ross Martin. Don Medford directed it, and Richard Matheson wrote it from his own short story. And it was like, what is that thing? And then the next year, I was at a friend's house, or a friend of the family, and they were showing The Long Morrow, which was a fifth season episode with Robert Lansing and Mariette Hartley. And but then, as with Bob, when the show went into syndication, it was showing in the afternoons here in LA on KTLA 5 days a week. So I would come home from school and it was on TV in the afternoons and I would watch it. And as with Bob, all of us, well, all of us kids were totally enthralled by it and would say, "Well, you remember that one about the guy, blah 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 blah, the guy who couldn't talk for a year, and he, et cetera, et cetera. The woman whose head was in bandages, et cetera." And so it was just like our common mythology, and we just loved it. I mean, people love the Twilight Zone. And the great thing is, and the thing that gives it such longevity, I think, is the quality of the show. It's not just about the gag, because you can watch it once, know what the twist ending is, and still watch it again and again and again because it's so wonderful, and you just love every bit of it.
They got wonderful actors in that series. I mean, if you look at the list of all the people who appeared in the series and all the people who appeared multiple times, I don't know how many Jack Klugman was in.
Or
Earl Holliman again, multiple episodes. Billy Mooney was in
three,
several
yeah,
really memorable episodes. Really
yeah,
made the series was that not only did you have these incredibly heady science fiction stories, which frequently had twists, but mostly, I mean, even when they didn't, they were incredible think pieces.
mm,
But there was also a moral behind most of the stories
yes,
where you'd have people with incredible flaws who were forced to either face them or succumb to them. And they were sort of like morality tales in a sense. It's
yes,
like, be careful if you're going to replace people with machines because Robbie the robot's coming for your job.
Right, yes. Or
And thank God that never happened.
Yes, exactly. And Monsters on Maple Street, which is a terrific story about mob hysteria, which is every bit as timely now, if not more so. And it's funny you mentioned Billy Mooney because I'm working with him on the new show that I'm shooting, Space Command, and we also worked together on Babylon 5. And yet, yes, The Twilight Zone was probably the first time I saw him before he was Will Robinson on Lost in Space. But he did 3 episodes of Twilight Zone. All of them are great. And The one he's best known for, of course, is It's a Good Life, where he plays a child with incredible psychic powers, and he's basically put the town he's grown up in is off in the void. There's no other country, no other planet, and he just terrorizes all the townspeople because he can send them to the cornfield if they displease him. It's a terrific episode. That was a Serling script based on a short story by Jerome Bixby, who was a very inventive science fiction writer.
Excellent. I first saw The Twilight Zone as a kid on TV, and they would have these New Year's Eve marathons or New
Mm.
Year's Day marathons, and that's
Yeah,
how I first saw these. And they feel like, to me, kind of almost mini film noir in many ways as well, because they don't always have a happy ending. They don't always have a clear ending. It can be very ambiguous, and something
yeah,
about that. And for television, it's so cinematic. So I
yeah.
think those are probably the qualities that initially drew me to it.
Yes, it's gorgeous. It's probably the best black and white television show in terms of the visuals. That was because its director of photography, George Clemens. Serling won 2 Emmys for Twilight Zone. George Clemens won 1 Emmy, and he was a camera operator from the beginning of film. He was on Blood and Sand with Valentino. He was on Monsieur Verdoux with Chaplin. He was, I mean, he was on the Mamoulian Jekyll and Hyde with Frederick March. I mean, just he came.
Wow.
Yeah, he came up in the golden age. When I was interviewing him, he pulled out a stack of autographed photos of Rudolph Valentino and Chaplin and assigned to him. And it was a stack this high, everyone who was a star at the studio. And so he really learned during the golden age of Hollywood. And many of the older actors that were in Twilight Zone, he would have filmed them, when they were younger, like Buster Keaton or, Ida Lupino. I mean, he worked with them in the heyday. And so he really knew his stuff. He was an old guy when he was working on Twilight Zone, and of course, even older when I interviewed him for The Companion, but just a genius, truly a genius.
Excellent. Well,
I
I
just saw Ida Lupino on Broadway.
Well, there you go. There you
I
go.
just saw her in a show with Mia Farrow
Huh.
called The Roommate. It's
Yes.
it's funny that you mentioned her. I'm like, I just saw her last week on Broadway.
do want to get the recipe underway for a minute. Give me a minute to get the recipe done, and then we'll get back to this fascinating conversation. The
Mhm.
recipe comes to us from a book that, out of all the gazillion cookbooks I own, this is the one I use extremely often. It's called It Came from the Kitchen, and it's monstrously delicious celebrity recipes from Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, assorted aliens, and beyond. And it's so well done. And the two men who wrote it are in the industry, and they got to meet a lot of these people. They write about their films. They have many filmographies. They've even interviewed family members and friends to authenticate many of these recipes. So this book is really terrific. So I'm going to read you what Robert J. Serling's brother had to say about Rod in this book here. Older brother of Rod Serling, who was the technical advisor on a couple of the original Twilight Zone episodes, including The Odyssey of Flight 33. He appeared on a documentary of PBS American Masters entitled Rod Serling, submitted for your approval. Okay, he says potato pancakes were Rod's sole contribution to the culinary arts. I do remember they were delicious. Rod carried the formula around in his head. Rob did an expert job of barbecuing on an outdoor grill, although I doubt whether this skill would qualify him for any honor roll of great chefs. Carol Serling called me and confirmed, other than this, his ability to cook steaks and hamburgers on the grill, the potato pancake constituted his only culinary skill. Rod's habit of putting ketchup on ice cream is another matter entirely and absolutely true. So, just learned a little bit about Rod right there.
Wow.
Oh my God, that's the most horrifying thing I've ever heard about him.
Yes. Wow. That's fun. That's fun.
And
Bob,
we discovered Bob was asking me if Rod Serling was Jewish. I honestly did not know, but it seems that he was.
Yeah, he was. And in fact, when I produced the Twilights on Blu-ray, I did a commentary with Neil Gaiman on Death's Head Revisited, the episode about the Holocaust that's set in a concentration camp after the war, because I'm Jewish and Neil Gaiman's Jewish, and Rod, of course, was Jewish, and so we talked about Jewish identity and writing and all that stuff, and it was great fun. But yeah, Rod was, a lot of people also don't know that Rod was short. He was 5'5", and so people were often very surprised to meet him and realize that he wasn't tall, and but he certainly had a huge personality. As I mean, he comes across great on screen. He's unique.
He looms large.
Yes.
So
Well,
this
the
he,
reason I was asking about whether he was Jewish earlier is
Oh.
because this potato pancake is
Yes.
probably something that he made for Hanukkah as a latke. And so it occurs to me this would be a holiday treat he would have enjoyed. The
Yes.
first day of Hanukkah this year is on Christmas, is his 100th birthday.
Wow.
So if you want to honor him on Christmas,
Yeah.
enjoy a good latke.
Yeah. And I'm sure this is a recipe he got from his parents, because they again, hailed from that culture.
my black cat that I adopted from the cemetery is making a big appearance here. Close up.
Hello,
Hi.
close up.
As long as it's on the right.
I
This happens every time. He loves attention. He used to
Sure.
sleep on Cecil B. DeMille's grave at the cemetery all the time.
Wow.
He
Uh-huh.
lives for attention, so that's how I named him Close. So,
Cool. Cool,
but
cool.
sweetheart, Mom, you gotta make your food now, okay? No, you can't have some. I fed you before the show started, sweetheart.
He
That so this wouldn't happen.
goes.
Well,
Yeah, exactly.
anyhow,
There he goes.
no, don't eat that. Okay, what we're gonna do?
Yes.
Okay, originally it makes 10 pancakes, but that's a lot, and I'm on my own here, so we're just gonna kind of scale down the recipe a little bit. But basically, what we need is our flour. Okay, and again, you can scale down or up in terms of the portions. A little bit of salt, which we have right here, sugar, and let's see, baking powder, baking soda. We have our milk. Then we have our eggs. So we basically combine all of these into a bowl with our mashed potatoes. So I cut and boiled some mashed potato before I got started here, but I'm going to stir all of this up. And basically, I'm going to stir it up and then I'm going to use my hot plate here and make it for us while we talk about Rod Serling. So,
Great.
yeah, we'll go ahead and cook while we talk here. And, I've been rewatching a lot of Twilight Zone to prepare for this episode. And I also watched the American Masters documentary about him, which was excellent.
Yeah, I'm in it.
You're in
So,
it. That's right. And it's really amazing how much World War II and his military service kind of scarred him for life, but also fueled his creativity and his artistry.
yes, yes. I mean, there was same with Gene Roddenberry. Gene Roddenberry was a bomber pilot, and that was that whole generation of men who went through the war. I refer to them as young old men because they were really far more mature than any other 20 somethings coming back from that experience. They were definitely deepened and altered by seeing life and death that close.
I
So
would
yeah.
that would make you go from a young person to a very old person very quickly, being in a war like that.
Yeah. And Rod, actually, at one point, Rod was in the jungle fighting the Philippines, and a Japanese soldier sprung up out of nowhere right in front of him with this rifle pointed directly at Rod, and Rod had no time to respond or defend himself. And he thought, I'm dead. I'm absolutely dead. And he was unaware that there was an American soldier right behind him who killed the soldier before he could kill Rod. But Rod had that moment of absolutely being certain he was going to die right then and there. So that's remarkable, really remarkable.
Well, it
So
must have been incredibly horrific to hear the gunshot.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, Rod wrote one of the great pieces about World War II ever written, which is the Purple Testament. It's the Twilight Zone episode about the soldier who can see the look of death on the faces of the soldiers who are about to die. It's a great episode. It's wonderful. And Leonard Nimoy has a bit part in that, interestingly enough. So, but it's a really good one.
Oh, wow.
Mm.
And it was interesting too how he was at the ground floor of the development of the medium of television, like
Yeah.
right when television was being born. So talk about that and what that was like to be at that ground level.
Yeah, well, Rod's initial sales were to radio shows, and but then TV was just coming into existence in America in the late 40s, and he was a natural for it. He was able to write very, very quickly, and he in 1956 he won his first Emmy for a live TV show called Patterns, and you can actually see that kinescope on home video and probably on YouTube for that matter. And then he wrote Requiem for Heavyweight the following year, won another Emmy. By the end of the 50s, he was the best paid and most famous writer working in TV. And it's funny because you're right, the beginning of television, the so-called first golden age of TV, it was like they were trying to figure out what you could do in the medium, how the medium would work. It's very much like the internet now. I mean, yeah, you're doing a cooking show and talking about the stars. You could have had that show on in 1954. It would have fit right in, and you could have had like, J. Carroll Nash or somebody, Rhonda Fleming. But it's like so Rod was hoping that television would be sort of a Broadway stage for the entire country, but then of course as the sponsors and the censors started to exert their will on content, he found himself constrained where he couldn't write about race, he couldn't write about social issues, couldn't write about politics. So that's what led him to Twilight Zone to create something that he could clothe in science fiction and fantasy and horror and get his point across, the social things he wanted to comment on, and worked like a charm.
You
I
can
found it
get
so
away with a hell of a lot
Mm.
by setting a story in the distant past or in the distant future.
Yes, yes,
A lot of Westerns told stories that you couldn't tell if they were set today.
yes,
And that especially goes for science fiction stories and stories that happen in the future. Like not all science fiction stories happen. Many of them are contemporary, but you
yeah,
put the science fiction spin on it, it creates a distance and
yes.
people you can make statements that you otherwise it would be frowned upon to make.
Yeah. Well, it's ironic because if Rod had just stayed in like mainstream television, he'd be forgotten today. Like his contemporaries, Reginald Rose, Tad Moselle, even Patty Chayefsky. They're kind of dusty footnotes, and you have to be a real video historian to know, television historian to know those names. But because Rod did the Twilight Zone, which then by making it more metaphorical, more oblique, it became universal. And so each generation, these episodes speak to them so you can be railing against the blacklist of the 50s and a lot of Rod's content is valid, like the obsolete man, things like that. Or we as we enter, Trump term two, again, there's so many things you don't have to wonder what Rod would have said about Trump and the current day issues because they're the same issues. It all comes around again. Issues of censorship, issues of altering the truth. It's science fiction, is dystopic, and Sterling very much thought of it as warnings. He was very,
Yeah.
yeah, he wasn't a cynic and he wasn't a fatalist, but he definitely was saying this is what we can do right and this is what we can do wrong.
Well, he wrote more than a couple of episodes about the rise of fascism and
Yes,
the danger that it presents and the
yes,
ways in which people could easily just fall back into it. The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street is a sterling example of that. I watched that episode. Every time I watch it, it becomes scarier. And the
yes,
same is true of The Shelter, where you
yes,
see these people who are these neighbors who are essentially family. And you
yes,
see that under a situation of duress, they devolve very quickly into Neanderthals who are getting ready to rip each other apart. And it's
yes.
frightening because this is us.
Yeah. Yes. And it's fascinating because, Rod, for the most part, they were shooting on the back lot of MGM, but he used that to great utility because he could, Monsters on Maple Street, he could just get the sort of the, meet me in St. Louis Street or the Andy Hardy Street on the back lot of Metro, and it would be perfect as a representation of any any city anywhere, any neighborhood anywhere. It's great. It looks gorgeous.
Can I call our attention to those pancakes?
I'm thinking a little bit to the skillet, so I'm kind of working on. Bob is violently allergic to cats, and since I have
Ah,
that, he cannot come over. But Bob, after the show, if you or Mark want to pull up in front of my apartment, I will run some hot potato out to you.
thank you.
The offer
Thank you.
is open,
It is a wonderful invitation. I am considering taking you up on it.
Certainly better than the ice cream with ketchup. So,
right? That's pretty good.
What flavor would he put it on? Vanilla? We put it on Rocky
I
Road?
had a little friend growing up, and he liked to put ketchup on vanilla ice cream and on eggs and on corn, which was
yeah,
insane.
there
Putting
you go.
ketchup on eggs, I can understand.
Yeah,
Putting it on ice cream is
Right?
it takes all. Yeah.
otherworldly.
By the
Yes.
way, one of the points that they did make in this recipe is to get some butter and brush it onto the pancakes while they're cooking. So I'm
Hey,
gonna do
Oh,
that right now too.
now, of course, when you talk about cookbooks, the great Twilight Zone cookbook, of course, Into Serve Man. You know the episode where it's a cookbook. They're cooking and eating people. So that was great. That's a great one.
It just struck me in revisiting these episodes how incredibly timely they feel now, all these
Yes.
years later,
Yes.
and even chillingly so.
Yes.
I
It's
mean, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say I agree with you. I'm I'm so gratified that the brilliance of the show in terms of the writing, the acting, the directing, cinematography, music, Bernard Herrmann, Jerry Goldsmith, my God, Franz Waxman, uh, the common wisdom is that young people don't watch black and white, but that's not true. The Twilight Zone is as popular now as it ever was, and people love it. And so quality will out sometimes, and that's a good thing. But and it's funny because sometimes people talk about colorizing this or colorizing that, but the Twilight Zone, it's so gorgeous in black and white. It looks so good, and
I think if you rendered those episodes in color, I think it
mm,
would rob them of a lot of their power.
yeah,
I
I think so.
agree.
I think so too. I don't want to see those in color. And but no, it's just phenomenal. And they just, really knew how to, make everything look just spectacular. And of course, they had William Tuttle, who was the great makeup genius. He was the first makeup man to win an Oscar for Seven Faces of Dr. Lau. But he did wonderful stuff. He did Eye of the Beholder for Twilight Zone and The Masks and many other great
How
episodes.
did he not get an Oscar for The Wizard of Oz? How did that not happen?
Bob, they didn't even have a makeup Oscar for ages. I
I
Of
mean,
know.
course not. No, they
I,
didn't have it until 1982, actually. The
yeah,
yeah,
first one
I mean,
actually,
Jack Pierce should have had like 10 of them.
of course.
For
Yes.
or at the very least, a Lifetime Achievement Award.
Or even if you want to
The
go back up to Lon Chaney, he was a genius as well, in terms of makeup and but yes, but thank God they have it now at least. That's it's remarkable. So
The only
those,
times they've ever had it was when they were extraordinary circumstances, like Dr. Lowe, and
yes,
also like Planet of the Apes,
yeah,
because without the makeup for Planet of the Apes, that movie would have been literally impossible. And the
yes,
idea that you could actually have people dressed up as monkeys and have the
yeah,
audience take it seriously, which was the
yeah,
big question. They did a
yes,
makeup test with Ben Nye
yeah,
to see, people with men dressed as monkeys, and can we do it without the audience laughing? And the
mm,
fact that they could show them that they could make the film. And
yeah,
then John Chambers did this monumental task and got
yes,
an Academy Award for it. But it wasn't until 1981,
hmm
or I think it was 1982, they awarded it. The very first one that got it was Rick Baker for
uh,
American Werewolf in London. And
wow,
ever since then, they've had a makeup award, and Rick Baker has won a ton of them.
yes. Well, he deserves them. I mean, he's
And
phenomenal.
deservedly so, absolutely.
Look at
And
these guys.
wow, those look great.
I think Rod
Rod,
is smiling on my efforts here.
Rod would be proud. Absolutely, absolutely. And it's so ironic now that we are looking forward to his 100th birthday on the 25th of December. The sad part that he died at age 50. So this is, it was such a premature death. It was complications from open heart surgery, and
It
it's
was 1974. I remember the day very vividly.
wow,
I was beside myself. I just couldn't believe this man was gone. And you know
yeah,
what? At that time, he was not just a writer and a television personality, he also did the narration for a series of specials for
Yes,
Jacques Cousteau.
yes,
And
that's right.
also, like In Search of Ancient Astronauts and things like that. You would
Mm,
hear his voice as a narrator, and it would
yes.
just add such gravitas to whatever you were hearing.
Yes, he did commercials as well, and so his well, almost every movie was like Rod was the narrator for that trailer. And so yeah, and the funny thing was, this is back when there were only three networks, and everybody, whether they watched every show or not, everyone knew what was on. Everyone knew all of the actors, all of the major personalities, and certainly some of them, like Rod, felt like family. So it was a deep grief when one heard that Rod had passed. It was I wouldn't have written The Twilight Zone Companion if Rod hadn't died so prematurely, because if anyone should have written a book about the Twilight Zone, it would have been Rod. And it was only with him gone, I thought, well, I want to find out about this subject, so I'll write the book. And I started that book when I was in my early 20s, and it's been in print ever since it came out. So that's
Here's what shocked me in kind of revisiting a lot of Rod's work in preparation for this episode was that to leave a legacy that tremendous at
yes.
that young of age is astounding. But also,
Um,
I read a quote where he said, "My work was merely adequate." And I actually almost cried when I read that quote because I thought, my God, he died without understanding his
no.
impact.
That's right. It's true, and it's really a shame. Yeah, his in his last interview, he said, "My work has been momentarily adequate." It's he didn't think he'd really succeeded, and that's a shame, because that's the one thing. If he were still with us, he would know that he had written something that really was, there's a good argument to be made that it was the greatest TV show ever made, and and its ripple effect is not just on the audience. Everyone who's making any kind of TV shows of merit, Rod is their icon. Rod is the person they try to pattern themselves after, whether it's David Chase with The Sopranos, or Vince Gilligan with Breaking Bad, or you name it. I mean, everybody, Ron Moore, etc. with For All Mankind. It's just we all are Rod's children in that way, because he was
I want
so
to I want to
huge.
nominate him. I want to hereby nominate him to be the patron saint of television writers and
Yes.
fantasists in general.
Yes, I think that's a good idea. We'd all wear little rod necklaces. But it's because prior to Rod, producers were in charge of television shows. They were above the writers. They could override the writers. Rod was really sort of the first modern showrunner, in the sense that he was at the very top of the food chain. He decided basically everything, ultimately. And the producers were subordinate to him, the non-writing producers. And so that set the mold that you get people like Gene Roddenberry and Chris Carter, and on and on and on and on. So he was the template.
And it just astounds me how strong that legacy still is today. And it just blows my mind to think of how briefly he was here.
Yes. Well, his output was astonishing. I mean, over the 5 years of Twilight Zone, it was 156 episodes. He wrote 92 of them himself. And at the same time, he was also writing movies like 7 Days in May. He was adapting the Twilight Zone scripts into short stories that were published in paperback collections. I mean, it was just incredible. And he did a phenomenal job. He was phenomenal. He dictated all of his scripts, letters, speeches, everything into a recorder, and then his secretary would type them up, and he'd make hand corrections. And that's one of the reasons he could write so quickly. And he considered himself a dialogue man. That was his great strength. So he would actually play all the parts in dictating the script. So he was a phenomenon. No, there's no one else who's come close.
He
Martha,
also unfortunately wrote in shorthand, and at the UCLA library they have tons and tons of volumes of steno paper where he's
Wow.
just written down like all this shorthand, and it's like this is useless. You know, you have to find somebody who can not only read shorthand but read the version of shorthand that he did,
That's
because I think
funny.
there were several kinds,
Yeah.
and
Well, it's interesting, because with the dictabelts, they thought they were all lost, the dictation recordings, and then they found 1,000 of them. And so I'm proposing a new show called Rod Serling's After Twilight, that Rod would narrate from that material, and among other things, we would be filming scripts that Rod wrote that never got made, and also scripts that Rod wrote in live TV days that haven't been seen in over 60 years. And so that's something I'm talking to the Serling family about now as a series. So hopefully I'll get to do that. It'll be great fun.
Mark,
Are
let me
people
ask you this. What was one of the biggest surprises that you found in doing this Twilight Zone companion, like a revelation, if you will?
Well,
You've
well, there were so many. The wonderful thing is that when I started working on the book when I was 22, it was only 2 years after Rod's death, so his house was still exactly as he left it. His widow Carol was living there. His dog was still there, this Irish setter. There was one room just of the awards, just the 6 Emmys and the Peabodys and the 3 Hugos and on and on. But up in the attic. And I went there all the time researching the book and working on the book and interviewing the Serling family and so forth. And up in Rod's attic, I found a box and it was unmarked. And I opened it up and it was filled with Twilight Zone scripts that had been written but never made. And there were scripts by Matheson and Charles Beaumont and Ray Bradbury, two scripts by Bradbury, in fact, and Arch Oboler. I mean, it was just a treasure trove. And so that was quite a discovery. And but also another thing I found out was Charles Beaumont, who was one of the other great writers of the Twilight Zone, around 1964, 63, 64, he started, something seemed to be wrong with him mentally. And he got to the point where he could pitch stories and still sell stories, but couldn't write them anymore. It was actually the early symptoms of a presenile dementia that would kill him by age 38. He was 33 when it started manifesting. And so all of the scripts, or the majority of the, well, first of all, several of the scripts in season 4 and all of the scripts in season 5 that are credited Beaumont were actually written by his friends instead. So, for instance, Talkie Tina, the one with Living Doll, the one with Talkie Tina, he outlined that with a friend of his named Jerry Soule, and Jerry Soule wrote the script and was not credited. So to be able to give credit where credit was due in the Twilight Zone companion, because none of these writers had ever talked about this stuff before, because it was, they didn't want to violate that trust. But by then, when I was interviewing them, enough years had gone by that they felt finally that they could talk about it, and that was quite a revelation. That was amazing.
so what happened with all of these scripts that were never produced? Is there any talk of putting out a volume of these unproduced scripts, as in paperback at least?
Some of them got made ultimately. Like for instance, there was a script by Matheson called The Doll. It was really a great script, and that was made ultimately by Amazing Stories, the Spielberg series, and John Lithgow actually won an Emmy for it. The Bradbury scripts, variations of those scripts were made ultimately, I think, for Ray Bradbury Theater. So they came up in various places, but there's never been a volume of, Rod Serling's attic, scripts, it crawled from Rod Serling's attic, and but that's a good idea, Bob. It's certainly worth doing. There was
Oh,
also
I'd pursue the hell out of that. I
uh,
would love to read unproduced scripts, and also even the ones that found a life after.
yes,
I'd love to read the original incarnations of them to see what they were like in their original versions.
yes, and there was an outline that George Clayton Johnson wrote called Sea Change that didn't get made. It was the one time the sponsor said this is too gruesome, and they had to pull it. And it's basically about a guy on a boat who loses his hand, and the hand grows back into a copy of him. So it's like a very really strange script, but really really fun, really fun. So but yeah, so that's some of the stuff I found. But there were endless discoveries, wonderful things, and just to be able to interview the directors and the writers and the actors and the producers of Twilight Zone, to be able to sit down with Bob Serling, Rod's brother, and talk about Rod when he was a kid and all that stuff. It was, most of them are gone now. And Earl Holliman, as you said, just went. And, it's the Twilight Zone companion is essentially an oral history of the Twilight Zone. And I was really, really lucky to get it. And all of those interviews I recorded on audio. So when I produced the Twilights on Blu-ray, I was able to excerpt a number of those audio interviews for the Blu-ray, something I couldn't have foreseen back in the 70s, of course, because that technology didn't exist.
Now, you mentioned that Ray Bradbury had a couple of scripts. I don't recall seeing his name on the show. Did he write any episodes that were produced?
He wrote one. He wrote "I Sing the Body Electric," and he and Rod had an extremely challenging relationship. And in fact, I have a YouTube channel called Mr. Sci-Fi where I talk about what happened. It takes 30 minutes to tell that story. And because I'd heard through William F. Nolan that Rod and Ray had had a falling out because when I found that box in Rod's attic, there was a handwritten note by Ray on one of the scripts saying, "Here, Rod, here's the latest, and looking forward to many more on Twilight Zone, writing many more for Twilight Zone." And three of his proteges were the main writers on Twilight Zone, other than Rod. It was Beaumont, Matheson, and George Clayton Johnson. All three were his proteges. So what was the story? But Rod would never talk about it publicly, and Ray never talked about it publicly. And years, decades later, after I finished The Companion, I became very, very good friends with Ray Bradbury. At first, I didn't even tell him I'd written the Twilight Zone Companion because I knew that it was a sore point, and he had not let me interview him when I was writing the book. And finally, I said we got to be good enough friends. So I said, "Okay, tell me what happened." And he told me, and it was fascinating because when originally he was going to be one of the major writers on Twilight Zone, he'd already written episodes of Hitchcock Presents and so forth. He was a very skilled script writer, and and then Ray called when Rod Serling got Twilight Zone picked up. He was not the science fiction devotee that Ray was certainly. So he called Ray and he said, I'm trying to find other writers for the show, and I don't know which way to turn. They opened it up to spec scripts, and that was a disaster. So Ray said, "Come on over. I'll make some suggestions." He took him down into his office in the basement and pulled out one book by Beaumont, one book by Matheson, one book by a British writer named John Collier, and they actually did one episode based on a Collier short story, and one book by Ray. And he said, read these and then let's talk. And he basically hired the writers that Ray suggested, and that became the core of Twilight Zone. But then Ray, initially when Ray started writing a couple of scripts for Twilight Zone, one of them it was not really producible via the technology they had then. And then the second one should have been made. It was a great script. It was a miracle of rare device about this mirage that becomes whatever city you've always imagined but never been to. And it was a wonderful script, and it didn't get made. And then with I Sing the Body Electric, Ray said, "You must not cut a word of this," and Rod said, "I won't." And then for running time, back then you had to cut a script to exact running time. They cut out one page, and that was the page that was the whole point of the story from Ray's reckoning. And Ray had a party that night to watch that episode with all his friends. And when he saw that that page was gone, he said, "That's it. I'm done. I'm done." And that was the end of that. So it's really a shame because there's so many great Ray Bradbury stories that would have been terrific Twilight Zone episodes, but that was not to be. So it's our loss. But two
And for
brilliant.
those people who aren't familiar, by the way, Ray Bradbury was best known, obviously, for writing incredible, basically magical realism as science fiction fantasy
Yes,
novels and short stories. But he was also a notable screenwriter. And for me, his adaptation of Moby Dick is an absolute classic because what he did, this is the version with Gregory Peck. What
yes,
he did in the script is he made changes to it that improved the story tremendously.
yes,
And if you've read the book, I mean, the book is fantastic if you can get through it. Many people
yes,
find it a challenge because it is very, a flowery language. It's a very long book. There's a lot in it about whaling. There are chapters about story and there are chapters about whaling, and sometimes they intersect.
yeah,
Um, but the book is one of the greatest novels ever written. But Bradbury found ways to make the story better.
yeah, yeah,
And so I recommend anybody to see that version of Moby Dick. And also, if you compare it with the final chapters and see the changes that he made, you'd
mhm,
be extremely impressed with him
yeah.
as a screenwriter. I mean, he managed to one up the greatest American novel ever written.
Yes, he was a wonderful writer, and of course he's best known today probably for Fahrenheit 451, which is his great novel about censorship and book burning and so forth. But he's definitely written many many wonderful stories and novels and everything. I mean, if you just type in Ray Bradbury on Google, you'll find many many wonderful things. It'll be just a treasure chest of delights. So
Now, now, me being me, I really want to hear more about those pancakes now because it looks like they're
yes,
fantastic.
they
They
look
are.
great.
By the way, did Rod Serling, Teresa Brown, my friend in New York, hey Teresa, she's asking, did Rod Serling have his own favorite episode of The Twilight Zone?
Yes, he did. His favorite was an episode called Walking Distance, which is this superb script that Rod wrote. When Rod was in World War II, at the end of World War II, his father died, and he asked for leave to go to the funeral, and he was not allowed to leave. And so he never got to say goodbye to his father, whom he loved very, very dearly. His father died at age 52 of a heart attack, and very suddenly, very unexpectedly. And so, in walking distance, a very tired and beleaguered executive, while his car is being serviced, he discovers he's walking distance to his old hometown from when he was a kid. And when he arrives in the town, it's his own past when he was a boy, and he gets to see his father again and finally have the talk, the loving talk that Rod would have loved to have had with his father. And in the episode, the father basically says you have to go back to your time. There's only room for the little boy that you were in this summer. And he says, but you've been looking behind you. You should look ahead. There's things in your world that can bring you joy as well. And I think it was Rod, riding the Twilight Zone and feeling very tired, and having his father, give him a loving piece of advice. It's just a jewel. It stars Gig Young. It's got a great performance by Frank Overton. Interestingly enough, Ron Howard, who became a great director, is in it as a little kid before the Andy Griffith Show, and or Happy Days, of course. And it has a phenomenal musical score by Bernard Herrmann, who also wrote, of course, the Psycho and Vertigo and many other great scores. So it was certainly Rod's most personal script. Absolutely.
Bob,
That's really
that's what they look
incredibly.
like.
Yes. Wow. Yum.
Even though I cut the recipe down dramatically, it still made about 7 of them.
Yeah, they look great. They look great, Rod.
I'll be right over.
So pull up in front of my apartment. I will bring out a paper plate, some butter, knife, fork. I'll get set up here. I'm going to try to take a bite of one.
You think
Mmm.
that's great?
Very good.
Yeah, maybe
Mm.
put some sour cream on it, something like that. It's looks great.
Sour
Rod Serling
cream
does not.
Uh-huh.
or applesauce
Yes, we're
Hmm.
both.
or
Yes,
both.
yeah, yeah, but not ketchup. Not ketchup. But
Okay.
but it's yeah. I mean, it's really lovely to see a recipe that Rod would have cooked. I mean, by the way, his daughter Anne has written a terrific memoir about her dad, and she actually reads the audiobook, so it's actually like hearing her talk about her dad, and it kind of takes you into that world very personally, very intimately. So I highly recommend it.
I wrote her asking her to be on the show and I never heard back, but I understand. I mean, he's an icon. I get it.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe she's got something against potato pancakes.
Mm. You're really good, Bob. You need to get over here.
Wow. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Mark, you
yeah.
can come here too. Just drop by.
Yeah, it's very tempting, very, very tempting. But uh, but I mean, the thing that's really remarkable about Rod that most people aren't aware of is the fact that as hard a worker as he is, I mean, he seems like a real workaholic. He still made time for his family. He still made time. I mean, he was, having card games with friends and playing tennis and going to on vacations. And, his kids did not feel that he was an absentee parent at all. He would lounge by the Olympic-sized swimming pool back of the house and dictate scripts in the morning. He used to joke that he was the only writer who could write a script and get a tan at the same time. And so they never felt that he was too busy for them. It was the
Amazing.
he was very yeah he made time for them. He made them special, and he had the two daughters, Jody and Anne.
That's really remarkable because you don't hear stories like that often.
No,
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 at
no.
all.
And so it was like he was
Usually it's just the opposite. You have these incredible geniuses, and it's like, as much as he raised all of us with his work, his family hardly knows him, and he never spoke with like you always hear these tragic stories that make you very sad. And
absolutely
it's
yeah,
wonderful. It's heartwarming to hear that
yes.
somebody of his caliber was as
Yeah,
prolific in a way, as a
yes,
family man, as
yes.
successful as a family man, as he was as a writer. So I knowing
It,
that.
it is remarkable, but he had such a big heart. I mean, the thing is, you get a sense with Sterling of when you see him on screen of authenticity. You have a feeling that, like, oh, I'd like to sit down with that guy. I'd like to, have a beer and talk with this guy. He actually taught at several colleges while he was actively pursuing his career in Hollywood. And so he'd have like summer breaks where he'd go teach at Antioch or Ithaca College, and he was just enormously present for the students and very he always learned their names. He always knew all their names, and he was just he he wasn't the big Hollywood ego coming into the room. He was a guy who was there to be encouraging and help them, and and really uh just be a regular kind of guy. So amazing.
That's really heartwarming to find out. I mean, one of the things about doing this show that I enjoy is when I first started it, it was like lockdown and everything. And people would sometimes message me and go, this star really didn't make this. And my answer would be, well, some of them did, technically. But even
Yeah,
if they didn't, it's a way to humanize them and a way to
yeah,
look at them as real people and not just an icon or just a
yeah,
whatever. So
yeah.
like thinking about him being really great at grilling or really speaking. It's just interesting to know that kind of stuff, to know more behind the legend with which we're all so familiar.
Yeah, it humanizes them, and it's great. And also, people, people would often cook to just relax, to just kind of decompress, and so I think when people say, well, the stars didn't make their own dishes, that may not be true because many people loved cooking, or they would have their own special recipe, and they would get together. There were pool parties or barbecues. I mean, it was a very social life for pretty much everyone back then. They weren't isolated the way so many people are nowadays. So yeah, yeah.
Definitely. So tell me, if you can quantify in ways that both of you have been inspired with your own work by Serling. Can you maybe describe that to me if that's
Sure,
possible?
sure. Bob, do you want to go first?
I kind of prefer you.
Well, I mean, Rod has had an enormous influence on me, obviously. The three shows that made me want to be a writer were Twilight Zone, Star Trek, and Outer Limits, the original versions of those three shows. They had a huge effect on me. And what I learned from those shows was 1 hour of one TV show, or even a half hour with Twilight Zone, can change your life forever. It can show you a path in the real world. It wasn't just momentary escapism. And and I and my heroes weren't the actors. It was like I didn't long to meet, William Shatner, but I noticed that the writers on all three of those shows, it was the same writers popping up over and over and over again. Harlan Ellison and, Beaumont and Matheson and Jerry Soule and DC Fontana and on and on. And Ted Sturgeon. And they were also writing the science fiction books I was reading, the short stories and novels. And I wanted to meet those guys. And then I wanted to learn how they did what they did. And I was the first generation of TV kids. So I loved the enormous power of television, the fact that it came into people's homes. With a movie, particularly a theatrical release, you have to pay money and go to the movie. But with television, it comes into your home. It's far more intimate. And particularly back then. And I just wanted to be part of that. And when I was a kid, I got to go on the set of the original Star Trek for the last episode they ever made, and Nichelle Nichols was very kind to me. And years later, I would cast her actually and shoot a scene with her. But so all of this television. When I got out of college, I knew I wanted to be a writer, producer, in TV. I'd sold my first short story when I was 19, and but there were no classes in how to make television. And so I thought, well, I'll write a book about one of the greatest TV shows ever made to learn how to do it. And by the time I was 22 or 23, I was writing for animation. That's where Bob and I crossed paths. My friend, our mutual friend Michael Reeves, brought me into television. So initially, I was writing Smurfs and He-Man and Super Friends and all those shows. But my goal was to write for shows like Star Trek and Twilight Zone and all of that. And so I did that for many decades, and Star Trek Next Gen and Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5 and so forth. And now with the new way of doing things, I via crowdfunding and selling investment shares, I have my own studio. So like this, it's the same as with Rod. He wanted total creative freedom and created Twilight Zone to give himself that escape hatch, as his brother Bob called it. And with Space Command, the show I'm shooting now, I have my own studio full of spaceships and giant robots, and I learned that from Rod as well. When he shot at Metro, he had access to every prop and costume and set ever made for any MGM production. When I produced Sliders at Universal, I asked if I had access to every prop and costume and set they'd ever made. And they said, well, no one's ever asked us that question. We'll find out. And they came back and they said, yeah. So we were using stuff from Jurassic Park and Time Cop and 12 Monkeys and on and on. So now with my studio, whenever a big budget science fiction movie or TV show ends, a lot of those sets and costumes and props come on the market at auction. And I buy those things on eBay, of course. And I buy those things to augment our production levels based on what we're building freestanding. So right now, I'm writing whatever I want to write. We're doing five pilots, 2-hour pilots beyond the 12 hours of Space Command. And we just started shooting my wife's feature of Voiceless Roar. So we're creating a repertory company of actors, just like Serling had with Klugman and Burgess Meredith and so forth. We've got Doug Jones and Bob Picardo and on and on. And so I learned everything that I'm doing now from Rod, basically, from what because he was the one thing that people don't often talk about with Rod is his astonishing toughness. Because when he was not allowed to write what he wanted to write in television, the medium television, when Emmett Till was murdered, the black teenager who was murdered in the 50s, Rod tried twice to write about it on television and was so censored that it became meaningless. And that propelled him to the idea of Twilight Zone, and he wrote 4 pilots of Twilight Zone, 4 pilot scripts before the final one got the series greenlit. He was determined. He was determined to get that show on the air. And it was his baby, and he said exactly what he wanted to say with that show. And he also provided a haven for other writers because he said to Beaumont and Matheson and George Clayton Johnson, we'll shoot what you write. We won't censor it. We won't run roughshod over it. And at first they didn't believe him, but when they started writing scripts and their first drafts were being shot exactly as they'd written them, they were blown away. It was amazing. And so that's formed my life, and now I have my own studio, and millions of people are seeing my work, and millions of people have seen Bob's work, and over the years, all of us. I mean, the reason we chose television is because it's a mass medium, and so our work lasts. I mean, there's shows I'm sure you wrote Bob years ago that people are still enjoying, and that's it. It really is very nice to do work that lasts, that means something to people, and I'm sure that a lot of people say to you what they've often said to me, which is, "Oh, you're responsible for my childhood," because you wrote so many shows that meant something to them.
I wrote
So
for Batman the Animated Series and for X-Men and for Disney's Gargoyles. And frequently I will go to conventions and people in their 30s or 40s will
yeah,
tell me that their my work made their childhood. And
yes,
it always warms my heart. It always tells me, that because oftentimes you feel like you're wasting your time. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, you're just working really hard and like back in the old days before the internet. I'd have an episode air and then I'd look at my telephone and expect it to start ringing or expect to get some kind of feedback or something. And of course that would never happen. And I'm sitting there just sort of like, and then for my sins, you did get the instant feedback from the internet and
yes,
really wish you didn't because
yes,
people love stuff respect, but at the time, everyone always finds things to complain about and to hate.
yes,
Nobody hates Star Wars like Star Wars fans.
yes, it's true.
Nobody hates Star Trek like Star Trek fans.
Yeah,
But I
it's
want to I want to circle around to Mark and just point out that you can certainly feel the influence that Serling had
mm,
on his work. Like there was an episode of Deep Space Nine
mm,
that was about who is writing in the 1950s, and he's writing the science fiction story for a pulp.
yeah,
And in it, there is a black commander for this space station.
yes,
And by the end of the episode, this writer is literally driven crazy by racism.
yeah,
And you watch the episode, and it is worthy of Twilight Zone. It is, for its themes and for its serious intent and for its
yes.
innovation. You just look
Okay,
at it, and it's like I am watching a Twilight Zone episode.
yeah.
And
Well,
I
it's a,
also want to point,
oh, go ahead.
and I also want to point out there is a Star Trek revival series. I forget if it was called Star Trek Phase Two or Star Trek New Voyages. What
Yeah.
was it? What was it under, Mark?
It was initially when I worked on it, it was Star Trek New Voyages, then it became Star
Okay.
Trek Phase 2.
Okay,
And
so
yeah,
he wrote an episode of New Voyages with Michael Reeves, a brilliant writer I had the pleasure of working with and the honor of calling a really good friend.
mm,
And Michael had come up with an idea for Star Trek Phase 2 in the 1970s, and it didn't get made because there was no Star Trek Phase 2. The idea was just lying there for decades, and the idea was that Sulu, um, ages. He disappears into a void and comes back, and he is now 30 years older. And
mm,
30 years later, in our world, in real life, Michael had the opportunity to revisit that and he and Mark rewrote it, reworked it, retooled it, and instead of George Takei wearing all this makeup to be old,
He was
he
older.
was in fact that age, and the
Yes.
actor playing a young Sulu got to play opposite him,
Yeah.
which was like a very, very brilliant set of serendipity that happened.
Yes.
But circling around, Mark directed this episode, and it is one of the best hours of Star Trek around. It's moving, it's
Hey.
smart,
Yeah.
it's got great emotion, it's got great there's philosophy. I mean, it hits every mark of what a Star Trek episode should be.
Hey.
And
And
again, you know, if you told me that this guy, was greatly influenced by Rod Serling, I'd be like, well, yeah,
obviously,
no
yes. But
surprise. Look at
one
this
thing I
thing.
should mention is on my YouTube channel, Mr. Sci-Fi, you can watch that entire episode. It's called World Enough in Time. If you go to the landing page on YouTube for Mr. Sci-Fi, MR period SCI hyphen FI, you can watch the entire episode of World Enough in Time. The Deep Space Nine episode is called Far Beyond the Stars, and I'm very proud of it. It was an amazing episode, and what we're shooting now is Space Command, which you can also watch on Mr. Sci-Fi. And the one other thing I wanted to mention is I just recently wrote a book called Greenlighting Yourself because my fans so far have given me $4 million to open my studio and shoot Space Command, and now I'm raising another 20. And so it's like a recipe. It's like making those potato latkes. And so I wanted to share that with everyone who wants a career in film and TV or books. It's completely different than it was when Bob and I started, and there were three networks, and that was the only game in town other than syndication. So we're in a different world now. And I like this world.
Definitely. Well, let me see what questions are rolling in. Karen Burroughs Hansberry is asking, the only episode I will not rewatch is It's a Good Life. It's so scary for me. Are there any episodes that the three of you find to be especially scary?
Bob,
Oh my God.
so many of
I
them.
revisit this thing every couple of years because it's so frightening. The monsters are doing me. It
Maple
is
Syrup.
just any episode where the monster is us
Mm,
is inherently frightening.
yes,
Watching an episode like The Shelter, where you're seeing these people who love each other, and within a 20-minute span, because that's how long the episodes are, these people are ready to rip each other to shreds. And then at the end of the episode, they realize, oh my God, now we have to live with each other.
mm,
Now we have to continue being neighbors and family, and yet we know how absolutely inhuman
mm,
we can be to each other. I mean, it's a heartbreaking episode, but any episode that shows exactly what monsters we are
hmm
it just cuts me to the core because Serling knew, I mean,
yeah, yeah. And for me, when I was a kid, Nightmare at 20,000 feet scared me. That's the gremlin on the airplane wing, the episode with William Shatner, and it's interesting because the Sterling children were not allowed to watch Twilight Zone. And one night, Anne Sterling crept downstairs, and her parents were watching Twilight Zone, and she peered through the banister, and it was Nightmare at 20,000 feet, and she was scared out of her mind, and she thought, "This is what my daddy does for a living." So, and of course, that episode was written by Richard Matheson, but just really, really scary, particularly for kids. That one's a real, yeah, it'll make you jump out of your boots.
yeah, when I was a kid and I saw The Invaders with
Yes, yes,
um,
Miss Moorhead, yeah,
Agnes Moorehead, and it's done without dialogue. You just
yeah,
have this woman walking through her house, and she's being bedeviled by these tiny little invaders from space.
yes,
And it has one of the great kicker endings of all time, but
yes,
just the kind of nightmare noir of
yeah,
it. I mean,
yes.
it feels like you're living inside a nightmare.
Yeah. Well,
And
that's another Richard Matheson one. And of course, Matheson was one of the great horror writers of all time. I mean, he wrote I Am Legend and was a huge influence on Stephen King. So yeah, these are I mean, these are genius writers. These are not just Serling. And one thing that was very gracious about Serling is in the coming attraction spots, if it was a script by one of the other writers, he would always credit them. So he'd say next week is a great episode by Charles Beaumont or another wonderful story by George Clayton Johnson. So and when he won the second Emmy, he said he would address the other writers by name on on the Emmy telecast and said and held up the Emmy and said, "Come over to my house, guys, and we'll carve it up like a turkey." So he was a real mensch, as they say.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, that's lovely.
I don't see any more questions rolling in here, but we've already been over an hour. So, do you guys have any final thoughts that you'd want to share or anything? Because again, the centennial of his birth is kind of, I think, a big deal, these 100-year anniversaries.
Yeah. Well, Bob, you want to start? Anything you want to say?
I just know that I'm going to be spending this Christmas thinking a lot about Rod Serling. I'll probably, put in all my DVDs and start watching them. There are lots of episodes that are just wonderful. And you know what? There's a wonderfully moving episode that no one really gives a lot of love to, and the episode is called Two. And it
Yeah.
features that screen couple that everybody loves seeing together so often, Elizabeth Montgomery and Charles Bronson.
Yes. It's a wonderful episode. It's a
It's
wonderful
a
episode.
story about the two people. They're like the last survivors after a nuclear holocaust,
Mm,
and it is a very, very human story, and it's a very, very lovely story.
mm,
And what was the name of the one? Oh, The Changing of the Guards.
yes.
Oh my
McDonald's.
God. That is
Yeah.
that is one of the greatest variations for me at least,
Mhm.
is variations on A Christmas Carol
Yes.
that I've ever seen. And it's a wonderfully moving story about a man who feels he's wasted his life and his life is over and it's meant nothing.
Mhm.
And that is the episode that actually makes me cry. There
Wow.
aren't many episodes that do that, but that one does. It is so moving.
Yeah. And, on Christmas night, I'm actually going to be celebrating Rod's birthday on the air on Coast to Coast with George Nuri, and of course the great Christmas story on Twilight Zone is Night of the Meek with Art Carney as a drunken department store Santa who gets to become Santa, the real Santa. And it's just a spectacular. It's a script by Serling, and it's wonderfully acted by Art Carney, and that's unforgettable as well. So there's so many great episodes of Twilight Zone to remember. And then the only other thing I would say is, if you want to hear me talk for 30 hours more, buy the Twilight Zone Blu-ray. I do 52 episode commentaries, and you can find the Twilight Zone Companion. Make sure you buy the third edition. It's 100 pages longer than the first edition. So there it is. Yes, and go on Mr. Sci-Fi. I'm posting all the time about everything science fiction, and it's great fun to have my own channel on YouTube. I mean, it's so funny because if Rod were with us now, he wouldn't be on CBS. He'd probably be on YouTube and have like Patreon and crowdfunding, and he'd be doing just fine. So, but we all love Rod and we remember him, and we are so grateful for the body of work that he created.
I agree. Again, it just staggers me. I just wish he could somehow know how influential he remains all these years later.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But thank God we get to have him still. Thank God for that. So, and
And
thanks.
we get to enjoy the potato pancakes as well.
Yes,
Come on
yes.
over, gentlemen. I'll text you the address and
It's really a delight to see you cook those, and that really brings Rod home in a new way for me. So thank you for that, and have a great holiday, and we'll all be raising a toast to Rod on Christmas Day, and thank heavens. So well, it's good seeing all of you, seeing both of you, and I'm sure we'll be talking more soon, Bob, and thanks for this opportunity. I really loved
Yeah,
it.
Carrie, thank you so much for having us. This has been a really wonderful time.
thank you, gentlemen. And please send me a link, Mark, to where I can post on my social media where people can hear you on Christmas on that radio show because I would love to try to tune in to that.
You bet, I will. So great. Well, you take care, and anything else you need, just let me know. I'm around.
Great. Well, everybody watching, I do have a Patreon for Hollywood Kitchen. All contributions go to help buy ingredients so I can test bake a lot of these recipes. And thank you to everybody. And please stay tuned for more food, fun, and film history from Hollywood Kitchen.